right, I see some people joining us. So while people are still hopping on, I just want to say thank you for joining us. We're going to be planning to host a bunch of these faculty sessions with various faculty on our campus throughout the month of April. We know that we're all, stuck at home and trying to make the best we can of these situations, but we really hope that this will give you a chance to interact with a faculty member who you may very well take class with if you do come to Binghamton, whether it's this coming year or in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our faculty member here with us today. This is Professor Steve Ortiz. He is part of the History Faculty Department. He is also on the PPL Advisory Board, and he is part of the Harper Prelaw Task Force. And Steve is going to share with us today a brief mini lecture, about 10 to 15 minutes, on Crises and Catastrophes, how a historical generation is made. You can feel free to use the Q&A box to point through any questions you may have, and Steve is going to bring up a few polls throughout the session to get your take on your thoughts and ideas of how this direction is leading. So feel free to answer those when they come up, and at the end we'll try to answer your questions both about the topic and about Binghamton in general, any questions you have about the history major, various departments. So with that said, take it away, Steve.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carrie. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our conversation. I hope it is a conversation in which you are, one, engaged, and two, asking questions about any of the things relating to the history department or the philosophy, politics, and law program, or being a pre-law student at Binghamton University. I am delighted to be here with you. I'm honored, really. I know that many of you are in very tough situations, and your ability to do this and your interest in doing this is terrific. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to this conversation. So one of the things I wanted to talk about first is the history department. And one of the things to mention, now 10 years, and it is a terrific teaching department filled with really productive researchers and writers of current history, of people who are producing new books on a routine basis. We probably have 4 or 5 books published every year by our faculty members. And yet we are a department that prides itself in our teaching of undergraduates. Almost 9 to 10 of our faculty members have won Chancellor's Awards for excellence in teaching. So that alone should speak to how much we take the teaching of undergraduates seriously. And there's a couple of really important things to mention about how it's different than maybe history classes you have been taking in high school. And this is not at all to denigrate or to in any way undermine what kinds of teachers you have there in your high school settings. But it's just a way to talk about what we do maybe differently and why that matters. One of the things is that our approach to history and a department of this, of researchers, is that we're really asking big questions. We're not interested as much in the, studying history is one darn thing after another. This happens, we're not fixated on the date, you have to remember this date, and that kind of approach. We're really interested in broad questions about transformation, about why things are the way they are, how things have changed, what are some of the big structural changes that have a big impact on Americans or other peoples around the globe. And that's a little bit different than maybe what you're used to. And one of the ways we do this is by taking a really global and comparative approach. I teach American history, and I teach modern American history, mostly since 1877. And that will be the feature of my conversation with you today. But our department is really deep in terms of the parts of the world that are studied, in terms of the eras of the world, from ancient Rome all the way to modern China, and all points and places on the map and on the chronology in between. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And also, one of the things that we're really focused on is understanding history not just as a set of things to give you, right? A set of content to give you, but rather a skill set that you were developing along the way. And so if you are interested in history, that's terrific. And we have all kinds of again, classes and content that will hopefully spark your interest even further. Some of the classes you may have heard some of the things. You'll find other classes in which you will have maybe no exposure to in your teaching thus far in K through 12. But skill development is really critical. And one of the things we really will try to make you into really strong analytical thinkers, how to read really closely into different types of voices and perspectives, how to analyze multiple sources, often contradictory information in them, and how to both communicate in writing and orally your arguments about what you feel about the past. So we are absolutely dedicated to that type of skill development. And it's something I think will serve you well as you move both into your larger academic careers, but also into your careers wherever they may take you. So let me then just get to what we're supposed to be talking about, which is the crises and catastrophes and how a historical generation is made. So human history has these kind of epic events that shape not just the moment, but long arcs of time. And they are transformative moments. And we can think of many of these in the kind of recorded human history, the Black Death plagues in Europe, the pandemics in the Americas after the Columbian Exchange, wars, famines, climatological disasters, volcanoes, hurricanes, things of this nature. And the transatlantic slave trade, something that, again, there's a kind of a sense that life around the world is different after these events than it was before. And again, because these are a lot of topics that you would study in this department. There are people teaching on a lot of those topics in Latin America or the Atlantic slave trade or in Europe. But my expertise is in U.S. history, so I thought I'd pivot to that. In the United States, of course, in the early part of the history of the United States, you have the Revolutionary era and all of its dislocations. You have things like the internal slave trade, the movement of enslaved peoples from the eastern seaboard of the United States into the Gulf Coast South and into the Cotton South. One of my colleagues very recently published a really important book on this called The Weeping Time. Ann Bailey has been featured on the New York Times 1619 project because of the ways that the internal slave trade was one of these one of these things that helped make a historical generation amongst enslaved peoples. Another colleague of mine has looked at the Civil War and the long-term ramifications of the Civil War in the South. Diane Somerville has recently published also an award-winning book called Aberration of Mind, about suicide and suffering in the South and the ways that the trauma of the Civil War impacted a generation of Southerners, white and black men and women. So there is a lot that we are doing in this department. My expertise is, again, in modern US, and I deal a lot on the impact of war. So I work often with veterans of certain conflicts and how they see themselves as a cohort or a generation. But let's kind of move here. So what does it mean then to be a historical generation, right? In part, let's think about what are some of the features that might be relevant to a historical generation. And that's that, often these really critical transformative events, crises, catastrophes, disasters, wars, change profoundly and almost instantaneously political attitudes and cultural attitudes of people. And this is done, historical change often happens in phases, right? But with these kinds of true markers in time, you see really important inflection points, that people begin to understand time differently, that time is assessed as before the war and then after the war, before the war, during the war, after the war, before the flood, after the flood, before the hurricane, after the hurricane, etc. And so when something is that profound that people actually mark time with it, it has a instantaneous almost effect on attitudes and on political attitudes, on cultural attitudes, and about way people's organize and think about their societies. So with that, let me launch that. So I would think, and I would maybe guess, since there are some of you here, that there are some who believe this, and it looking like, as I see the tallying there, that some who believe that the pandemic, the current pandemic, will lead to a new historical generation, and you very well may be right, because it certainly has some of the characteristics and some of the features of what I would call really important markers of historical generation. And one of the things that I think is really important is that those events often change the way people think about already preconceived notions about the way things work. And they change the ways that people, the people in authority, often because they are unable to grapple with the enormity of these kinds of problems, whether they be in ancient times, religious figures, or whether they be in contemporary time, political figures. One of the markers of historical generation is that there seems to be an almost overnight loss of standing for traditional authorities and customary ways of doing things. That, I think, then it leads to a kind of, instead of believing preconceived or shared wisdom about how things are supposed to operate, all of a sudden the ground underneath you shakes, and not just because of an earthquake, right? It shakes because all the things that you have been taught no longer seem to apply. So that's one marker. A second marker is a widely shared collective experience and emotions. In the United States, this has often been war, because wars have tended to be the things that reach all Americans at once. Natural disasters in a country of this size and geographic expanse, you know, a flood in the Mississippi Valley in 1927, 28, it's important, sure, and it is crushing to the people there. Or the 1935 hurricane that hits the Florida Keys and South Florida. You know, these are things that really impact people desperately in one part of the country, but because our country is so big, and because the geography is so different, that, you know, there haven't been as many of the natural disasters that have impacted people in the United States nationally. Now, of course, at the state level and regional level, that happens all the time. The wildfires in California, for example, this past year, that was something that I'm sure is a marker for people who live in California, but maybe not for us here in New York. So, but something big enough that it impacts all of our collective kind of experiences and our emotions is the second kind of critical feature, right? So loss of standing for traditional authority, a shared collective experience and emotion. And then the third is one that is also important, is that, and it's the kind of A plus B equals C, right? So A is loss of standing for traditional authorities and forms of authority. B is this wide shared collective experience and learned lessons from the event. How do people take what they have experienced in this big collective way that has overturned their preconceived notions about the way society is supposed to function? How are they then supposed to craft new lessons, new authority, new ways of approaching the world after that? And so those three things are really important. And I'm going to launch a second poll question here to see what you think would be the most important of these from your opinion. Again, there's no right answer here. This is just your opinion. Okay, so those are the kind of three markers I would point to as important things. Let's talk then about specifically my research area and my teaching area, which is the 20th century United States. So one of the things that you should consider is that when I talk about historical generation, I'm not just talking about people born the same year or the same couple of years. It's all these other kind of social, cultural, political, economic features that are the historical lived experience that become what makes a historical generation. Excuse me. So, I'm going to talk about two if I have the time. I'll talk, and then we can get to your questions in a few moments here. But the two I would mention, first of all, would be what has become known as the greatest generation, the generation that came of age during the Great Depression and World War II. And the Great Depression, with its enormous level of social dislocation, the national scope of that social dislocation, the ways that everyone has suffered some enormous kind of setbacks, basically, in that era. There were very few who escaped deprivation during the Great Depression, no matter where you were in the country. And then right on the heels of the Great Depression, and kind of right at the end of the Great Depression, was World War II. And those two things, those two historical catastrophes, really. I mean, these are crises, an economic crisis, and then followed by a global conflict against totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. Those two conflicts really shape a generation going forward in really important kinds of ways. First of all, the Great Depression overturned decades of notions about how business was the primary kind of concern of the United States, of the US government, was to support business, that the United States economy was kind of always growing, would it forever grow and take care of people, as that economic growth meant wages and work and what have you. And that the long Great Depression and the financial crisis undermine a lot of the kind of traditional authorities in this country as pertain to things like unregulated capitalism, or came to a political economy that privileged business over everyday people. So then you segue into World War II. And there's a kind of fight for freedom and for collective security of the American people in this increasingly dangerous world. That generation, they lost kind of traditional authority. They had the collective experiences of deprivation, of going into battle, 16 million people going into the military, fighting overseas, and what have you. And the lessons they learned were really profound. They believed that security, personal security, economic security, social security, and collective kind of national security. Security becomes a buzzword for these people. That the ways to approach life were emphasizing security and collective endeavor over individuals and everyone kind of out for themselves. So that was a big part of this. The second generation I would mention would be the kind of 60s Vietnam generation. And in this, likewise, the authorities of government, the authorities of political authority, of religious authority, that in the Vietnam kind of 60s generation, people questioned the wisdom that had brought the United States into the Vietnam War. They questioned the government, whether the government was lying to people about the Vietnam War. And this becomes a real undermining of traditional authority itself. Likewise, the emotions about the war were pronounced, but this is where the Vietnam War is different. This is where I want to kind of end, or the Vietnam kind of 60s era is different. And this is where I want to end today and get to some of your questions, is that the shared lessons from these crises and catastrophes seems like the greatest generation has a pretty consistent kind of emotional and political response to these things. But ironically enough, the lessons of the 60s and the Vietnam generation ends up being rather polarized, and that people take very different lessons about what the impact of the 60s and the Vietnam War were. And it leads to, in many ways, the polarized political environment and cultural environment that we are living in today. So while the crisis and crises of the 60s and Vietnam era were transformative, people's approach to them and the kind of responses that emerged from that crisis led to widely different kinds of impact. So I guess, do you have a sense of whether or not you will have what the long-term impact of this pandemic will be for you? Do you think you know what it's going to be? Because I think that one of the problems, and I see some of the questions asking us, what is it going to be? What's the impact going to be? Sometimes you don't really know. And the Vietnam era really proves that you are sometimes what you think would be the impact, 20 years later, you look back and say, wow, that was totally unanticipated. I would never have guessed that was the impact. But you can trace it very clearly if you do the historical groundwork to do so. So with that, let me thank you for listening to this riff about crises and catastrophes and the making of historical generations, and let me move to some of your questions. Let me actually look through some of your results first. I'm curious to see. So some of you feel, so about half of you feel that you know right now what the impact will be, and you very well may be right. And I'm going to be sharing with you, actually I'll share it with you right now, something that has just been posted, predictions. You guys can check this out on your own, but there is there's a collection here. This is a Politico piece, but they asked like 30 people, what do you think is going to be the long-term repercussions of the epidemic? And there's lots of different things here, but what's interesting is that about half of them contradict one another, right? People are saying what's going to happen is this, and then the other people are saying no, not that. It's going to happen. No, that's going to happen is this, and so we will find out. But certainly, I know that your generation will be the one. I believe, like most of you who have voted, that let me check that number myself. I believe, like most of you who have voted, that this will be, you will be a historical generation, and that what those lessons will be very interesting to find out. Okay, with that, thank you very much for listening, and I will move to some of your questions. So, Carrie, should I go to the ones on the screen here? All right, let me see here.
Yep, go ahead, Steve. So there's.
Okay, so let me answer. I'm going to answer. I'm not going to type answer. I'm just going to hit answered. So, how big are the history classes across the department, and how does the size of those classes affect the way the classes are taught? That's a great question. So, we have varying sizes here. So, we teach the large U.S. history classes at the freshman level are taught in a big way because every single student who graduates in the state of New York has to have some American history. And that means that basically every single student who comes to Binghamton has to take or have had taken or done really, really well on the U.S. history region exam. Classes are rather big. Once you get outside of those entry-level U.S. history classes, they begin to winnow down into much smaller classes. I would say at the 200, 300 level, our classes average about 50. We have some that are 30, but they're probably between 30 and 50 would be the norm for sophomore and junior level classes. And one of the benefits of the department's approach to this is that we teach some bigger classes in the 100 level, but that allows us to teach senior seminars with only 15 students in them. So once you get into the end of your career in the history department, your classes get far, far smaller, and you are taking a class that may have 10, 12 people in it, and that's your senior seminar experience, your capstone experience in that class. So how does it affect it? A great deal, right? So I teach a class for modern American history for freshmen. It is more of a lecture. You have smaller discussion sections that you go to and talk with teaching assistants about. You have a good conversation there, but the lecture is much bigger. Whereas every class I teach other than that are based on intensive discussion of the material and how those things are going. Okay, let me move to a different question.
Steve,
here.
why don't you move to the bottom question?
The bottom question. Yes,
before,
sure.
Going into
So Prelaw. So one of the things that I am very, very involved in multiple ways is Prelaw. So you know, there is no Prelaw major at Binghamton University. There are, every major is considered to be pre-law. That said, history, political science, English, philosophy, politics, and law tend to be the majors that most students who are going to law school will major in, sometimes double majoring in those, sometimes a major and a minor, what have you. So there is not one pre-law major, right? There's kind of a pre-law track. But one of the things that you should know is that Binghamton has an enormous level of success with its students getting into law school, really good law schools, and doing well in law school. And there are many parts to that, what I just said. So our students do well in terms of applying, in terms of being admitted, in terms of gaining financial support to those law programs. But almost as importantly, it's the skill development aspect that I was talking about. The I mean, PPL and political science would speak this way too, that it's developing skills so that once you get into law school, you are able to do well in law school. One of the really critical things that you should keep in mind is that if you get great grades by taking not so challenging coursework, you might get into law school, but what's so important to law school experience now is to do well in your first semester. And if you simply don't have the chops, the skills developed the way that Binghamton University and the various majors who train a lot of pre-law students can do, if you don't have those skills, you're just not going to do well. And law school is going to be a challenge for you to get through, but also to then kind of profit at the end. So that is one of the things I would say to you, that you can major in anything, but you want to major in things that really accentuate your ability to analyze, to write, to communicate, to think deeply, to read closely. Those skill sets, no matter what major you are in, will determine whether or not you're a successful applicant for law school, and whether or not, more importantly, you're a successful law student. So that's some of the ways I could speak to that answer. I could speak to other specific questions if they come up. Okay, all right. Is that a good stopping point for that one?
Yeah,
Please ask follow-up questions on pre-law. Let me add one more thing on pre-law. So it's not just about the academic preparation. It's about all kinds of programs. We have the Harper Pre-Law Advisor, who's terrific at helping students make the decisions about whether to go to law school and how to get into law school. We also have the Harper Alumni Council, Law Alumni Council, which is an extraordinarily vibrant alumni organization of people who have come to this university, gone to law school, become successful attorneys in various capacities, from trial lawyers to government lawyers, and they are so willing to help Binghamton students succeed as an undergraduate doing a pre-law track and to then do well into law school. That rich tradition of training lawyers that this university has actually pays a lot of dividends. So that people in the law schools that people would want to go to know that Binghamton University has a great record of producing great lawyers, but also it has this kind of giving back that Harper's Prelaw, the Harper Law Council alumni really give back to current students who are seeking that kind of path. So that's a really distinctive feature of this university that makes it a really great place to do pre-law training. But again, I want you to kind of get away from the idea there's one major, right? You can come here, you can be an engineering major, you can be a philosophy major, you can be and you pick it, you can be a major and still go to law school. It's about thinking about the training and the skills as opposed to a major. Okay. So let's see, where should we go next? Okay, let me go this one about traumatic. Let me just go this one about traumatic from Dylan Murray. Actually two from Dylan Murray here. So need they be traumatic? I don't know about traumatic in the sense, in a kind of clinical sense that we would think about trauma now in terms of like producing post-traumatic stress disorder or what have you. But we know that things that are really undercut the kind of net that is underneath all of us, or we think we know the way things work, right? And for some that may not be traumatic in a clinical kind of way, right? They may not need counseling, they may not need to think of this as post-traumatic stress. But I do think that the richness of the emotional response does have an impact on the creation of a historical generation, right? So if you're talking about emotional responses pretty close to the mean of your emotional daily lives, it doesn't register the same way that something deeply traumatic would, right? That deep trauma, it just kind of opens up all the airways and all these new things come flooding in. And it also is probably more important towards that undermining of pre-received authority that is, I think, a really important part of a historical generation. That this generation doesn't feel itself as just doing the next thing that their fathers and mothers have always done, but they can't do the things their fathers and mothers have always done because life is different as they know it now, right? And do you get to that place without a really emotional, traumatic thing? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe you might be able to handle it better, but I think the trauma is in some ways fairly important.
I think, Steve, if you follow up with Charlie,
Yeah,
his question, I think that's a good
sure.
segue.
Positive events. For a lot of people in the United States in particular, World War II is a positive event, right? It's a positive event in so many different ways. So you think about the larger American society, yes, they are sending loved ones into conflict. Yes, it's almost 500,000 American service personnel will die in the conflict. But the American homeland is basically secure. People are working, they're making lots of money, they're putting money aside for savings bonds. There is some rationing, yes, but you're not talking about large levels of deprivation. For many women and African Americans, for example, Latinos, Native Americans, this provides a terrific opportunity to both find work that they had not been able to find, so high value manufacturing work with high wages, and to feel like they are part of a collective endeavor to fight for freedom and fight for the United States. So I do think in some ways there's a positive aspect to this with World War II, right? That it can be seen in those ways. You could argue similarly with the Civil War, Southerners and African and the freed slaves, right? This is a positive experience, coming out of slavery, but one in their lives still built on a lot of deprivation and a lot of turmoil and a lot of change. So I think World War II would be the best example of a kind of earth-shattering positive type of development. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm gonna save the question about classes and majors and skill development just for a moment, because I've had the opportunity to respond to that a little bit at length. Let me just go to the other two, then I'll come back to Ashley, your question in just 1 second. So let me get back to questions about history here. Dylan, I think I answered your other question. No, there's a collective, localized, let's see. Yeah,
Steve,
so yeah,
questions from the very beginning too that we were asked beforehand that are in the chat. If you're
yeah, that's right.
As well.
So yes, so
those are Isabel, and I see she's on as well. Isabel Kalezi.
Okay, sure. So let me go to the one in the chat. How about that, Carrie? So sure. Do I think there will be a shift in educational learning to becoming more reliant on technology? I think there has been an ongoing shift towards higher education in particular being reliant on technology. And I see this being a kind of tipping point for that personally. This is a personal opinion. This is based on no historical, expertise. But I do think that so much of what we've been seeing in piecemeal ways, this experiment of a massive scale, something that people are always reluctant to do when it comes to this type of change, that change of massive scale being forced on us, means that people will say, look, everyone survived. Educational technology is not just the wave of the future, it's the current, it's the moment, it's the now, and there'll be a lot more use of it in various kinds of ways. I do think, however, and you all are at home taking either online classes, maybe as part of your high school curriculum now, and I'm certainly hearing this from students of mine in my current class, is that they have found the move to online teaching a challenge. They miss the personal interaction. They miss the conversation and the dialogue. And that for them, this might lead to a different perspective, that something they took for granted, the ability to stop and raise your hand and have a professor look you in the eye and see if you're getting this, and all these things that we take for granted about face-to-face interaction and about face-to-face classroom experiences. For some, that might be a powerful incentive to seek more of that out and less of the kind of web-based educational learning. It's hard to say, but I think there will be many who support this now, saying, look, we've done it to the scale, but this is the wave of the future. What's the key takeaway for me? And this is something I will let you guys. I don't know what the key takeaway is, and I guess maybe the key takeaway of this little conversation should be that we'll be figuring out for a while here what people of your generation believe and feel about this. And it's going to be most transformative to you. So let me just pause here for a second and address this. One of the things that political psychologists have really helped us understand is how transformative events help shape long-term political perspectives. And what they have found is that key political events that are these types of crises, catastrophes, or whatever that lead to the undermining of traditional authority and authority figures, that they are most transformative to people between the ages of 16 to 25. Why? Because one, those people are they are still in stages of brain development. So basically, you're actually hardwiring in the lessons that you have learned as your brain continues to develop into early adulthood. Two, because your political perspectives and identities at that point are very malleable, and they are often just received from your parents or people close to you. And so they are most shakeable, I guess. They're most malleable, they're most easily transformed. And that after 25, people's political opinions and perspectives are rather hard to shake. For those of you who are 18 now, I'm sure that there are just 100 times you're watching TV and there are political figures on the TV over the age of 60, and they're having a conversation, and you quite literally don't understand what they're talking about. And it's because the experiences that have shaped those political the experiences that have shaped their political identities often happen in their teens and 20s. So for leadership today, it's the late 60s, it's the early 70s, it's the late 70s, right? And so that means that they have a hard time seeing the world outside of those transformative moments in their political identification. And you just don't see it, right? You don't see it the same way because your political identities are being forged now. And so, and they don't have those reference points and those markers that those people do. So it's a really big deal. What that will mean for you guys in 5 or 10 years, I'm not really sure. So back to that, I don't really know, right? So where should I go next?
Why don't you go to Ashley's question and then we can finish up with the last two.
Sure. So Ashley, one of the things I'm very lucky to do is work quite closely with the Harper Prelaw advisor, Alex Jablonski. And I've heard him talk about this quite a bit. So it's something that I will tell you, that the American Bar Association, if you go to their website and look up, what are their preferred kind of training for attorneys, they will say any major, right? And so, but they will emphasize a couple of things here, and so does Alex, that it should be things that interest you. That doing a major simply to do a major because it's supposed to be a pre-law major doesn't make sense if it's not something that personally excites you and challenges you to be your best student you can be. The second part would be about challenges. That you should take coursework. I mean, you shouldn't be, masochistic about this and take only the hardest classes, but you should take classes that challenge you, because skill development is based on challenge. I mean, if you're an athlete, you don't get better by under training, right? You get better by training harder than you might actually perform in an athletic event. And it's the same with skill development and academic development. And so it should be interesting to you. It should be challenging to you, and you should be working on those skills, again, of close reading, analytical thinking, oral and written communication, and strong argumentative writing. All those things should be skills. Now, many majors accentuate those skills. Some don't. And you don't have to, you can still be I'll say biology major that doesn't do maybe the strong writing the same way, but then maybe be a history minor or an English double major or something that you can kind of accentuate both sides of those skill sets is a way to approach that. So there really is no one set of classes or one major for sure, but it's about a mindset of interest, of challenging, and of thinking about the skills that are going to be important in law school, and how are you going to sharpen those, and very consciously trying to sharpen those throughout your college career. Okay.
Steve, we'll try to wrap up with one or two more of these questions. I think we'll try to do 5 more minutes at the most, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, let's go to Ryan's, if you don't mind, about
Sure.
Spanish flu and isolation. Okay. So about asking about whether or not it leads to the pandemic, the current pandemic will lead to more of an isolationist kind of perspective. Based on the ways that World War I and the retreat from World War I and the Treaty of Versailles had done in 1919, and then further exacerbated by the issues involving the flu, the influenza outbreak of 1918-19. Well, one of the things I would tell you is if you took my class, you would hear full many-part sections on how in reality, the 1920s in the United States are far from isolationist. So my first answer is let's question the conventional wisdom about how isolationist the United States is in the 1920s. Yes, there are tariffs. Yes, there's immigration restriction from Southern and Eastern Europe, but there is a broad level of immigration from Latin America that was not restricted by the immigration restrictions, and the United States is unbelievably internationalist in its perspective during the 1920s in terms of the expansion of business abroad, in terms of the movement of peoples abroad, in terms of things like some of the first student exchange programs and student study abroad programs are started in the 1920s. The 20s are actually far more internationalist than one would lead you to believe. And again, one of the things I do in my classes is talk a lot about this because people have been taught World War I, then isolationism. And one of the things we unpack is how much that is true and how much that is a little bit, not a myth, but a little bit not all completely true. So will the United States withdraw from its global kind of perspective here? There's been evidence that there's already some shifting away from the larger kind of globalization moment of the 1990s on, or from 1945 on, or whatever era you want to depict it. But the reality is that we are far more entrenched in our global cultural kind of environment in which it's really hard to withdraw from how deeply entrenched we are as a global society now. And if all countries around the world tried to do this, it would lead to a great deal of dislocation in addition to the dislocation of the coronavirus pandemic. So I don't know if that's going to happen. I know that it didn't happen necessarily after World War I, an era that we think of as this happening. So I'd be surprised if it happened fully after this era too. What the responses will be. So that's my answer to that question, I guess. Any more that I can answer? I think those are pretty good for now, right, Carrie?
Yeah. I think we've covered a lot. I just want to thank you, Steve, again for taking your time and sharing. I think our students have gotten a lot out of this. I know I have, and I think it's been really helpful, not only the talk, but also sharing more about the history department and Prelaw, the other programs that we have to offer. So with that, I think we're going to end there, but I want to thank everybody so much for joining us. Steve, you have
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
If any of you are interested in having a conversation about any of these things beyond the confines of this 45 minutes, my email address is sortiz@binghamton.edu. And I am more than happy to converse with you about all these things or any of these things. Just do me a favor and put in the subject line, like per today's conversation or per the webinar or whatever, so that I know where it's coming from. But I'm more than happy to continue the conversation, okay?
Thanks so much, Steve. I've actually added to the chat too, so everyone can see Steve's email as well. So anyone can, thank you so much, Steve, reach out to him and continue the conversation. It's been some really great and engaging questions. So just want to thank everyone for joining us. And I think we'll end there. And thanks again, Steve, for taking your time.
You're welcome.
And for
Take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.